The fluorescent lights of St. Jude's Medical Center hummed with that particular frequency that burrowed into the base of the skull. It was the kind of sound that lives somewhere between hearing and feeling, a persistent reminder that everything in this place was sterile, cold, and unforgiving. 2:17 in the morning, the witching hour of the emergency room, when the coffee had long since gone cold and the patience of the night shift staff had worn thinner than surgical gauze. Maeve Bennett stood at the nurse's station, her head bent low over a stack of patient charts. Her hands moved with mechanical precision, organizing files that didn't need organizing, straightening papers that were already straight, anything to keep busy, anything to avoid eye contact. She was 32 years old, though the premature gray streaks threading through her dark hair made her look older. Much older. The harsh, overhead lighting did her no favors, casting deep shadows beneath her eyes, shadows that spoke of sleepless nights and memories that refused to stay buried. Her scrubs hung loose on her frame. She'd lost weight since arriving at St. Jude's 3 months ago, not from lack of eating, but from the constant low-grade anxiety that lived in her chest like a second heartbeat. The way she moved told a story all its own. Every motion was careful, calculated, as if she were navigating a minefield instead of a hospital corridor. Her shoulders stayed perpetually hunched forward, her spine curved in a defensive posture that made her appear smaller than she actually was. She was hiding. That much was obvious to anyone who bothered to look closely. Unfortunately, the staff at St. Jude's didn't bother to look closely at Maeve Bennett. They saw only what they wanted to see. A nervous wreck masquerading as a registered nurse. "Check out the ghost." The voice came from behind the medication cart. Jessica Corwin, the head charge nurse, leaned against the counter with the casual cruelty of someone who'd found an easy target and intended to exploit it thoroughly. Jessica was everything Maeve wasn't. Confident, loud, comfortable in her own skin. She wore her authority like armor, and she wielded it like a weapon against anyone she deemed weak. "I swear to God," Jessica continued, her voice pitched just loud enough for half the nurse's station to hear. "I dropped a bedpan yesterday about 5 feet from her, and she flinched like a grenade went off. Like full-body flinch, nearly knocked over the crash cart." 2 other nurses giggled. Maeve's hands stilled on the chart she was holding, but she didn't look up. Her knuckles went white against the manila folder. "How the hell did HR clear her?" Jessica went on, warming to her subject now. "She's useless. Last week during that MVA, she literally froze when I asked for the trauma shears. Just stood there staring at the wall for like 10 seconds. The giggling spread. Maeve could feel their eyes on her back, could feel the weight of their judgment pressing down on her shoulders. She wanted to tell them, wanted to explain that the dropped bedpan had sounded exactly like the aluminum storage containers that had clattered across the floor of the field hospital in Kandahar when the mortar round hit 30 meters out. Wanted to explain that 10 seconds of stillness wasn't freezing. It was assessing, categorizing, determining whether the threat was real or just an echo from the past. But she said nothing. She just tightened her grip on the clipboard until the edges bit into her palms. "She's a diversity hire." The new voice cut through the ambient noise of the ER like a scalpel. "Doctor." Caleb Sterling emerged from the supply room, a prescription pad in one hand and that particular expression of smug superiority that seemed to be standard issue for second-year residents. Sterling was 28 years old and walked the halls of St. Jude's like he owned them. Everything about him screamed privilege. The expensive watch, the designer cologne that was always just a bit too strong, the way he spoke to nurses as if they were furniture that occasionally made mistakes. "Has to be," Sterling continued, not bothering to lower his voice. "I asked her for a 16-gauge IV during the trauma intake 3 nights ago, and she just stared at the tray for 5 seconds before moving. 5 seconds. He paused for effect, looking around to make sure his audience was paying attention. "In my OR, 5 seconds is a lifetime. Hell, 5 seconds is the difference between a patient walking out of here and rolling out in a body bag. More laughter. Maeve's jaw clenched so hard she felt her teeth grind together. She forced herself to take a slow breath through her nose. In through the nose, out through the mouth. Grounding technique number 3 from her therapist's arsenal. She wasn't in an OR. She was in a nurse's station in Seattle. The year was 2025. She was safe. She was a civilian. She was Maeve Bennett, RN, and she was not going to react. The truth was, she'd hesitated before handing Sterling the 16-gauge catheter because she'd seen the patient's medical history. Severe thrombocytopenia, platelet count in the basement. A large-bore IV on a patient like that was asking for a bleed they couldn't control. She'd wanted to suggest a smaller gauge, wanted to point out the lab values that Sterling had clearly skimmed over in his rush to prove how decisive he could be. But she'd learned quickly that Dr. Caleb Sterling didn't appreciate suggestions from nurses, especially not from nervous, quiet, pathetic nurses like Maeve Bennett. So she'd handed him the 16 gauge and said nothing. And sure enough, the patient had developed a hematoma the size of a grapefruit at the insertion site. Sterling had blamed it on Maeve's shaky hands during the setup. She'd taken the write-up without protest, added it to the growing file that Mr. Henderson, the hospital administrator, was no doubt compiling in preparation for her inevitable termination. "Bennett!" Sterling's voice cracked across the nurse's station like a whip. Maeve didn't jump, but she felt the familiar spike of adrenaline dump into her bloodstream. Her heart rate kicked up. Her vision sharpened around the edges. She turned slowly, keeping her eyes fixed somewhere around the knot of Sterling's tie. "Yes, doctor?" "Room 402, the post-op appendectomy. His BP is spiking. I told you to push labetalol 20 minutes ago. Why is the chart empty?" Sterling was standing over her now, using every inch of his 6'2" frame to loom. It was a tactic he employed frequently with the nursing staff. Physical intimidation wrapped in the authority of a white coat. Maeve's fingers twitched at her sides. Muscle memory wanted to react in ways that would end very badly for Dr. Sterling. Instead, she forced her hands to remain still. "I checked his vitals, doctor," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "His heart rate is bradycardic, 52 beats per minute. If I push the labetalol, a beta blocker, it could have dropped him into the 40s, potentially caused a cardiac event. I was waiting for you to reassess before administering." "You were waiting." Sterling's voice was dangerously soft now. He leaned in closer, and Maeve could smell the coffee on his breath, could see the tiny burst capillaries in his eyes from too many overnight shifts and too much stress. "You were waiting to think," Sterling continued. "You don't get to think, Bennett. You do what I order. You are a nurse. I am the doctor. If I say push the meds, you push the meds. Do I need to report you for insubordination? Again?" The word hung in the air between them. Again. As if Maeve made a habit of questioning his orders. As if her careful, considered approach to patient care was somehow a character flaw rather than the result of years of training in environments where a single mistake meant body bags. "No, sir," Maeve said. She dropped her eyes to his shoes. Expensive leather loafers, scuffed around the toes. "I'll do it now." She walked away, feeling the heat of their stares burning into her back, feeling the weight of their judgment, their mockery, their casual cruelty pressing down on her shoulders until she thought she might collapse under it. Behind her, she heard Jessica's stage whisper, "Pathetic. She's going to kill someone one day." Maeve pushed through the door into the medication room and leaned against the cool tile wall. Her breathing came in short, sharp gasps. The walls seemed to press in around her. She closed her eyes and immediately regretted it. The smell of antiseptic vanished, replaced by the acrid stench of burning jet fuel and the metallic tang of blood. So much blood. The walls of the medication room dissolved, replaced by the cramped interior of a Pave Hawk helicopter, the rotors screaming overhead, the airframe shuddering with each violent maneuver. She saw his face. Young, 23, maybe 24, half his jaw missing, the bone exposed in gleaming white against the red meat of torn muscle and tissue. His eyes were wide, terrified, locked on hers. His hand gripped hers with desperate strength. "Stay with me, Doc. Stay with me." But she couldn't. She couldn't save him, couldn't stop the bleeding, couldn't do anything but watch as the light faded from his eyes and his grip went slack. Maeve's hand shot to the rubber band around her wrist. She snapped it hard, the sharp sting of pain cutting through the memory like a knife. Once, twice, 3 times. The medication room swam back into focus. White walls, stainless steel, the faint hum of the refrigeration unit. She was here. She was now. She was safe. She wasn't Doc anymore. She was Nurse Bennett. And she needed this job, needed the anonymity, needed the quiet routine that kept the memories at bay. She took 3 more deep breaths, pushed herself away from the wall, and went to prepare the medication that would probably do more harm than good. But Dr. Sterling had given the order, and Maeve Bennett, the ghost nurse, didn't question orders. Not anymore. What Maeve didn't know was that someone had been watching her, someone who saw past the hunched shoulders and the downcast eyes, someone who recognized the signs of a soldier trying desperately to become a civilian. Colonel Garrett Hawthorne stood in the shadowed alcove near the staff entrance, one hand resting lightly on the handle of his cane. He'd been observing the nurse's station for the past 15 minutes, watching the dynamics play out with the trained eye of someone who'd spent decades reading people. Hawthorne was 73 years old, though he wore his age well. His hair had gone silver years ago, but it was still thick, cut in the same high and tight style he'd maintained throughout his 30 years of service. His face was weathered, deeply lined, the kind of face that suggested stories best told over whiskey in quiet rooms. He moved with a slight limp, the result of shrapnel taken during Desert Storm in 1991. The fragments had lodged in his left hip and lower back. The surgeons had gotten most of it out, but some pieces were too close to the nerve clusters. Better to leave them in than risk paralysis, they'd said. So Hawthorne had learned to live with the pain, the way he'd learned to live with a lot of things. He'd been working as a security consultant at St. Jude's for 6 months now. It was a far cry from his previous career, but the pay was decent and it kept him busy. Kept him from sitting at home dwelling on things that couldn't be changed. But tonight, watching Maeve Bennett navigate the minefield of the night shift, Hawthorne felt something stir in his chest. Recognition. The kind that came from seeing a kindred spirit, someone who'd walked through the same fires and come out the other side scarred but unbroken. He'd noticed her on her first night. Hard not to, really. While everyone else had written her off as nervous and incompetent, Hawthorne had seen something else entirely. He'd seen the way her eyes tracked movement with the precision of someone trained to identify threats. He'd seen the way she positioned herself in every room, always with her back to a wall, always with clear sight lines to the exits. He'd seen the scars on her hands. Not the kind of scars nurses typically acquired. These were chemical burns, old and faded, but distinctive. The kind you got from field-expedient wound irrigation in environments where sterile saline wasn't available. The kind you got from using whatever was on hand to keep someone alive while bullets snapped overhead. And he'd seen the way she moved when she thought no one was watching. The efficiency, the economy of motion, the way her hands remained absolutely steady when performing technical tasks, only to tremble when she reached for her coffee cup. That was the tell. That was what separated the nervous wreck from the warrior fighting to keep the war locked away inside. Hawthorne had put in a quiet request to see her file 2 months ago. Mr. Henderson had been reluctant, citing privacy concerns, but Hawthorne had 30 years of practice at getting what he wanted. A few carefully worded reminders about security protocols and background checks, and the file had appeared on his desk. It had been thin, too thin, Transfer from a VA hospital in Ohio, nursing license current, references adequate but generic, and a single line in red text at the bottom. Personnel file classified by order of DOD. Clearance level, top secret/SCI. Hawthorne had stared at that line for a long time. Then he'd closed the file, locked it in his desk, and said nothing. He'd served long enough to know what that classification meant, knew the kind of work that earned it, knew that people with files like that didn't end up working night shifts at civilian hospitals unless they were running from something. So he'd watched, and he'd waited, and he'd made sure that when Maeve Bennett was working, he happened to be nearby. Not obviously, Hawthorne hadn't survived 3 decades in naval special warfare by being obvious. But he'd been there when the drunk patient in Bay 6 had gotten aggressive, and he'd stepped in before security needed to be called. He'd been there when the meth addict in the waiting room had started making threats, and he'd quietly ushered Maeve to a different part of the ER until the situation was contained. He hadn't spoken to her directly more than twice, once when she'd dropped a stack of charts and he'd helped her pick them up, his eyes lingering on the scars that ran across her knuckles and up her forearms. Once when they'd passed in the corridor and he'd nodded, and she'd returned the gesture with eyes that held far too much knowledge for someone who was supposedly just a nurse. But tonight, watching Dr. Sterling humiliate her in front of the entire staff, Hawthorne felt his jaw tighten. He knew men like Sterling, had served with officers who thought their rank made them infallible, had watched them make mistakes that cost good people their lives. The difference was, in the military, there were consequences. In civilian hospitals, apparently, arrogance was rewarded with authority. Hawthorne shifted his weight, his hip sending a sharp spike of pain up his spine. He grimaced, adjusted his grip on the cane, and made a mental note. Something was coming. He could feel it in his bones, the way old injuries always flared up before a storm, the way his instincts, honed over decades of combat, started screaming warnings before the bullets started flying. Maeve Bennett was a bomb waiting to go off. The question was whether the explosion would destroy her or everyone around her. Hawthorne hoped, for all their sakes, it would be the latter. 2 weeks crawled by with the grinding inevitability of a slow-motion car crash. Maeve kept her head down, took her shifts, and endured the mockery with the stoic resignation of someone who'd survived far worse. The rubber band around her wrist developed a permanent indent in her skin from constant use. Sterling's abuse escalated. Small humiliations grew into public spectacles. He'd taken to calling her Nurse Nervous in front of patients, had written her up twice more for failure to follow direct orders when she dared to suggest alternative approaches to patient care. Jessica had started a betting pool in the break room about how long Maeve would last before she either quit or got fired. The smart money was on fired. Through it all, Hawthorne watched and waited and prepared himself for the inevitable moment when the careful facade Maeve had constructed would finally crack. That moment came on a Tuesday afternoon. It started with a sound that anyone who'd spent time in emergency medicine knew and dreaded. The long, continuous wail of multiple ambulance sirens, growing louder, converging on the hospital from different directions. Mass casualty incident. The radio at the nurse's station crackled to life, the dispatcher's voice tight with controlled urgency. St. Jude's, be advised. Major MVA on I-5 northbound near the convention center exit. Multiple vehicles involved. Initial reports indicating 20-plus casualties. First ambulance's ETA 3 minutes. The ER exploded into controlled chaos. Dr. Thaddeus Prescott, the chief of medicine, appeared from his office and began barking orders. Nurses scrambled to clear beds, pulling stable patients into the hallways to make room. The trauma bays were prepped, supplies stocked, crash carts positioned. Sterling materialized at the center of the storm, his usual arrogance replaced by something that might have been excitement or might have been fear. It was hard to tell with him. "Bennett, he shouted across the crowded nurses' station. Trauma Bay 3, you're with me. Try not to screw it up. Maeve nodded once and moved toward the bay, her heart rate already elevated, her hands already starting to tremble. This was it. This was the moment she'd been dreading since the day she'd walked through St. Jude's doors. The moment when the carefully constructed walls between Maeve Bennett and the person she used to be would start to crack. She could feel it coming, could feel the old training rising to the surface like a body floating up from deep water. The first ambulance arrived 3 minutes later, right on schedule. The bay doors burst open and the gurney came through at a run. Paramedics on either side, one doing chest compressions, the other squeezing an ambu bag. Male, approximately 45, driver of a sedan that was T-boned by a semi, the lead paramedic rattled off. Unconscious at scene, GCS of 8, intubated in the field. BP crashing. We lost his pulse twice en route. They transferred the patient to the trauma bay, and Maeve got her first good look at him. His name, according to the chart being thrust into her hands, was Michael Donovan, construction worker, wearing jeans and a work shirt covered in drywall dust and now soaked with blood. His face was ashen, his lips were turning blue, his chest rose and fell with the mechanical rhythm of the ambu bag. But something about the movement was wrong. Maeve's clinical brain, the part that had been forged in field hospitals and the backs of helicopters, started cataloging details with cold precision. Asymmetrical chest rise, right side moving more than left, tracheal deviation, subtle but present, jugular venous distension in the neck. Her hands stopped trembling. It's just bruising from the seatbelt, Sterling announced, barely glancing at the patient before making his pronouncement. He was too busy trying to orchestrate the chaos, trying to look like he was in control. Get him a chest x-ray when the machine opens up, Sterling continued. Give him some Tylenol and move him to the hallway. We need this bed for the criticals. Maeve stared at him. The words didn't make sense. They didn't fit with what her eyes were telling her. Michael Donovan was critical. He was more than critical. He was dying. Doc. Donovan's voice was a wheeze, barely audible over the chaos of the ER. It hurts to breathe. You broke a rib, Mike, Sterling snapped, already turning away. It hurts. That's how it works. Bennett, move him. Now. Maeve moved to the bedside automatically, her hands reaching for the wheel locks on the gurney. But she stopped. Her eyes went back to Donovan's neck, to the subtle bulge of his jugular vein pulsing against his skin. Stop. The word came from somewhere deep inside her, from the part of her that had kept dozens of men alive in situations that should have killed them. Stop, Maeve said aloud. Sterling spun around, sweat dripping from his brow, his face flushed with stress and caffeine. Excuse me? Don't move him, Maeve said. Her voice was different. The rasp was gone. The whisper had vanished. What remained was flat, cold, and carrying the unmistakable weight of command. He's not stable. The trauma bay went quiet. Even the ambient noise of the ER seemed to fade, as if the universe itself was holding its breath. I am the attending here, Bennett, Sterling hissed, stepping toward her. I cleared him. Move the damn bed. Look at his JVD, Maeve said, pointing to Donovan's neck. Her hand wasn't shaking. It was perfectly, absolutely steady. Look at the tracheal deviation starting. It's slight, but it's there. And listen to his breathing pattern. He's air hungry. This isn't a broken rib. She looked directly at Sterling for the first time in 3 months, met his eyes, held his gaze. It's a tension pneumothorax, Maeve said, and it's evolving fast. If you move him to the hallway, he codes in 5 minutes. He dies in 7. The entire trauma bay crystallized into a moment of absolute stillness. The kind of stillness that exists in the microsecond before an explosion, when the world holds its breath and waits for the shockwave. Jessica, who had been stocking gauze nearby, froze mid-motion. 2 other nurses stopped what they were doing and turned to stare. Even the ambient chaos of the ER seemed to fade into background noise. Dr. Caleb Sterling looked at Maeve Bennett as if the hospital mouse had just spoken in a language he didn't understand. His face flushed from red to purple, his jaw working soundlessly for a moment before he found his voice. "You are a nurse," Sterling hissed, stepping into her personal space, using every inch of his height advantage to loom over her. "You do not diagnose. You do not speak. You do not—" The cardiac monitor screamed. The sound cut through Sterling's tirade like a chainsaw through silk. Every head in the trauma bay whipped toward the machines, displaying Michael Donovan's vital signs. Blood pressure, 60/40, falling. Heart rate, 140, climbing. Oxygen saturation, 82%, plummeting. "He's crashing!" Jessica's voice went shrill with panic. "Oh God, he's crashing!" Michael Donovan's eyes rolled back in his head. His body went rigid on the gurney, every muscle locked in a seizure of oxygen deprivation. The awful blue tinge spread from his lips across his face like ink bleeding through water. Sterling's arrogance drained away in an instant, replaced by the wide-eyed terror of a second-year resident who had just made a catastrophically wrong call and knew it. Get the crash cart," Sterling stammered, backing away from the bedside. "Tube him. Get anesthesia down here. Get—" "No time." Maeve's voice cut through the chaos with the precision of a scalpel. She didn't wait for permission, didn't wait for Sterling to stop gibbering orders, didn't wait for anyone. In one fluid motion, Maeve reached into the pocket of her scrubs. Her fingers emerged holding a thick, 14-gauge angiocatheter needle. Not from the supply tray on the crash cart, from her own pocket, as if she'd been carrying it, waiting for exactly this moment. She ripped Michael Donovan's gown open with her free hand, exposing his chest. The right side was visibly distended now, the intercostal spaces bulging with trapped air that had nowhere to go. "Bennett, what the hell are you doing?" Sterling lunged forward, reaching for her arm to stop her. Maeve caught his wrist mid-air. Her grip was iron, absolute, the kind of grip that comes from years of grappling training, from dragging wounded men twice your size out of kill zones, from holding on when letting go means death. Sterling yelped, his knees buckled slightly under the pressure, his expensive watch digging into his wrist bones. Maeve didn't even look at him. Her eyes were locked on Michael Donovan's chest, specifically on the second intercostal space, just lateral to the sternum, the exact anatomical landmark for emergency needle decompression. "Step back," she ordered. It wasn't a request, it was a field command, delivered with the expectation of immediate obedience. The kind of command that had been obeyed in places where disobedience meant body bags. Sterling tried to pull away. Maeve squeezed harder, and something in his wrist made a small popping sound. He dropped to one knee, his face contorted in pain and humiliation. "Step back." Maeve released him. Sterling scrambled backward, clutching his wrist, his mouth working but no sound coming out. Maeve's left hand palpated Michael Donovan's chest wall. Once, twice. Finding the landmark through touch alone, through muscle memory trained in darkness, in chaos, where you couldn't always see what you were doing. She didn't hesitate. She drove the 14-gauge needle into Donovan's chest at a 90-degree angle, piercing skin, subcutaneous tissue, intercostal muscle, and finally the pleural space. The sound that followed was unmistakable, a high-pitched hiss, like air escaping from a tire, as the trapped pressure in Donovan's chest cavity rushed out through the catheter. It was the sound of death being cheated. Michael Donovan gasped, a massive, life-affirming intake of breath that filled his lungs properly for the first time in 10 minutes. His back arched off the gurney. His eyes flew open, wide and terrified but alive. The cardiac monitor's scream settled into a steady beep. Blood pressure climbing, 70/45, 80/50, 90/55. Oxygen saturation, 85, 88, 91, 94. heart rate dropping back toward normal, 130, 120, 110. Maeve taped the catheter in place with quick, efficient movements. She checked Donovan's pupils with a penlight, equal and reactive. She palpated his radial pulse, strong and steady. Then, and only then, did she let herself breathe. She turned to find the entire trauma team staring at her. Not just the trauma team, half the ER staff had materialized in the doorway, drawn by the commotion, standing in stunned silence. Dr. Sterling was still on his knees, clutching his wrist, his face the color of old paper. Jessica's mouth hung open, a box of gauze pads forgotten in her hands. Two other nurses had backed against the wall, as if Maeve might turn on them next. Needle decompression, Maeve said quietly. Her shoulders slumped forward again, her spine curving back into that defensive posture. The moment of command evaporated, replaced by the familiar, submissive crouch. Standard protocol for tension pneumothorax. I'm sorry, doctor. I panicked. You panicked? Sterling's voice was barely a whisper. He climbed slowly to his feet, still cradling his injured wrist. He looked at Maeve, then at Michael Donovan, who was now breathing comfortably, his color returning to something approaching normal. Sterling couldn't deny it, couldn't pretend it hadn't happened. Maeve Bennett had just performed an advanced emergency procedure without authorization, had physically assaulted an attending physician, and had saved a man's life that Sterling's arrogance had nearly killed. His ego couldn't process all of those facts simultaneously, so it did what damaged egos always do. It lashed out. "Get out," Sterling said. His voice trembled with rage and humiliation. "Get out of my ER. You're done, Bennett. I'm going to the board. You'll never work in medicine again. Not after assaulting me. Not after—" "That's enough, Dr. Sterling." The new voice came from the doorway. Dr. Thaddeus Prescott, chief of medicine, pushed through the crowd of onlookers. He was 68 years old, silver-haired and distinguished, with the bearing of someone who'd seen everything twice and wasn't impressed by much anymore. Prescott walked directly to Michael Donovan's bedside. He examined the taped catheter. He checked the vital signs. He looked at the patient's chest rise and fall with normal symmetry now. Then he turned to Sterling. "Dr. Sterling, you will submit a full incident report to my office within the hour. You will also submit yourself for a peer review evaluation, and you will not speak to Nurse Bennett again until I have completed my investigation. Is that clear?" Sterling's face went from red to white. "Sir, she assaulted me. She saved a patient's life," Prescott said coldly. "A patient you misdiagnosed and nearly killed. Now get out of my trauma bay before I have security escort you out." Sterling fled. Prescott turned to Maeve. His expression was unreadable. "My office, 1 hour. We need to talk." Maeve nodded. "Yes, sir." She walked out of Trauma Bay 3, past the staring nurses, past the whispered conversations, past all of it. She went to the locker room, sat down on the wooden bench, and began to untie her shoes. It was over. She'd broken cover, exposed herself. In one moment of clarity, she destroyed 3 months of carefully constructed anonymity. She was fired. It was inevitable now. She'd have to move again, find another small town, another hospital that didn't ask too many questions, another place to hide from the ghosts. Her hands shook as she reached for her bag. Not the surgical steadiness from 10 minutes ago. This was the aftermath, the adrenaline dump, the crash that always followed the high. Her fingers brushed against the old dog tags hidden in the inner pocket of her backpack. She pulled them out slowly, holding them up to the fluorescent light. The embossed letters were worn, but still legible. Mitchell, Maeve S., Lieutenant Commander U.S. Navy, OPOSDEVGRU. Beneath that, barely visible, a second line, call sign, Valkyrie. She stared at the tags for a long moment. Then she shoved them back into the bag, deep into the bottom where they belonged. "My name is Maeve Bennett," she whispered to herself. I'm a nurse, that's all. Just a nurse. But even as she said it, she knew it was a lie. Outside the locker room, beyond the thick walls and the locked doors, a new sound began to grow. Low at first, distant, easy to mistake for the rumble of thunder or the noise of traffic on the interstate. But Maeve knew that sound, knew it better than her own heartbeat, had heard it hundreds of times in a dozen countries, in deserts and mountains and valleys that most Americans couldn't find on a map. The deep, rhythmic thump of helicopter rotors, getting louder, getting closer. Her hands froze on her shoelaces. Her breath caught in her throat. Every muscle in her body locked up as the sound grew from a distant rumble to a physical presence that rattled the windows of the locker room. "No," she whispered. "Not here. Please, not here." But prayers don't stop helicopters. And the past, no matter how deeply you bury it, always finds a way to dig itself back up. The sound grew into a roar that shook dust from the ceiling tiles. The kind of roar that meant a very large, very powerful aircraft was getting very, very close to the ground, in a place where helicopters had no business being. Through the high window of the locker room, Maeve could see shadows moving across the glass. Rotor wash kicked up debris in the parking lot, sending garbage and leaves swirling in a miniature tornado. Then came the impact, the thud of landing gear compressing under weight, the whine of turbines spooling down but not shutting off, maintaining high idle, ready for immediate departure. Someone was landing a military helicopter in the physician's parking lot of St. Jude's Medical Center, and Maeve had a terrible, sinking certainty that she knew exactly who they were looking for. The emergency room had descended from controlled chaos into absolute pandemonium. Patients were screaming, some from pain, some from fear, most from the sheer, overwhelming sensory assault of a military helicopter landing less than 50 yards from the ambulance bay. The massive rotors created a pressure wave that rattled instruments on trays, sent papers flying from the nurse's station, and triggered every car alarm in a 3-block radius. The automatic sliding doors at the ambulance entrance blew open and jammed there, stuck at full extension by the force of the rotor wash. Cold air and the smell of aviation fuel poured into the ER. Dr. Sterling stood in the middle of the chaos, his injured wrist forgotten, staring at the massive shadow descending outside the windows. His face was the color of old milk. "What the hell?" Jessica breathed, her eyes wide. Is that military?" Mr. Henderson, the hospital administrator, came running from his office, his tie askew, his face flushed with exertion and outrage. He was a small man, soft around the middle, with the kind of bureaucratic authority that worked beautifully in boardrooms and completely failed in real emergencies. "This is unacceptable," Henderson shouted to no one in particular. "Who authorized this? Someone call the police. Call the FAA. This is a violation of—" His voice was drowned out by the final touchdown. The helicopter settled onto the asphalt with a groaning complaint of hydraulics and metal. The landing gear compressed, absorbed the weight, and held. Through the open ambulance bay doors, the entire ER staff could now see exactly what had landed in their parking lot. It was an MH-60M Blackhawk, but not the standard military transport variant. This machine was matte black, completely non-reflective, with no identifying numbers or unit markings visible on the fuselage. No white stars, no tail code, nothing. It was a ghost bird, the kind of helicopter that existed in the shadowy spaces between official military operations and actions that governments preferred to deny. The kind of helicopter that belonged to Joint Special Operations Command. Sterling recovered his voice first. "This is insane," he shouted, his earlier terror transforming into righteous indignation. "They're landing in the staff parking lot. That's a violation of FAA regulations. I'm going to have their licenses pulled. I'm going to sue for damages to my—" The side door of the Blackhawk slid open with a metallic clack that cut through Sterling's tirade. 4 men jumped out. They didn't climb down carefully. They didn't wait for the rotors to stop spinning. They simply dropped the 6 feet to the ground and landed in a tactical crouch, weapons at the ready. These were not National Guard soldiers. These were not Coast Guard rescue personnel. These were not anyone that the staff of St. Jude's Medical Center had ever seen before, outside of movies. They wore multicam trousers and tan t-shirts stretched tight over body armor plates. Their helmets were high-cut ballistic models adorned with strobes, IR markers, and quad-tube panoramic night vision goggles flipped up like insect eyes. Load-bearing vests bristled with magazine pouches, medical kits, fragmentation grenades, and other tools of controlled violence. And they were armed, heavily armed. Short-barreled HK-416 rifles with suppressor cans hung from single-point slings across their chests. Sidearms rode in drop-leg holsters. Combat knives were strapped to plate carriers. They moved with a predatory fluid grace that spoke of thousands of hours of training and real-world application. Their eyes scanned the perimeter in overlapping arcs, clearing sectors, identifying threats, processing information with the cold efficiency of apex predators. They didn't look like visitors. They looked like they were securing a landing zone in hostile territory. Paul, the overweight security guard who usually spent his shifts watching sports on his phone, stood frozen near the entrance. His hand hovered near the pepper spray on his belt, but he made no move to draw it. Some part of his hindbrain understood that pepper spray would be spectacularly inadequate for this situation. Dr. Sterling, however, had apparently lost all sense of self-preservation. He marched forward, his white coat flapping in the rotor wash, one hand raised like a traffic cop. "You cannot land here. This is a private medical facility. You are trespassing. I'm calling the police right now." The lead operator didn't slow down, didn't acknowledge Sterling's existence, simply walked forward as if the doctor were a ghost. His shoulder checked Sterling hard enough to send the younger man stumbling backward into a row of wheelchairs. Sterling went down in a tangle of metal and plastic, his earlier bravado evaporating into shocked silence. The lead operator keyed his radio. "Havoc to base. We are on deck. Securing the asset now." His voice was gravel, low and dangerous, with the flat affect of someone who delivered similar reports in far worse circumstances. On his plate carrier, a Velcro patch read simply, "Breaker." Mr. Henderson found a reservoir of courage he didn't know he possessed. He stepped in front of the automatic doors, blocking the entrance, his arms spread wide like a man trying to stop a freight train with his body. "Now see here," Henderson said, his voice cracking only slightly. "I am the administrator of this hospital. You cannot bring weapons into this facility. Who is in charge here? I demand to speak to your commanding officer." Breaker stopped. He looked down at Henderson. His eyes were ice blue and bloodshot, with the flat, 1,000-yard stare of someone who hadn't slept in 3 days and had seen too much death to be impressed by civilian authority. He was also a full head taller than Henderson and probably outweighed him by 80 pounds of muscle. "Move," Breaker said. It wasn't loud. It wasn't aggressive. It was simply a statement of fact. Move or be moved. "I will call the police," Henderson squeaked, his courage faltering. "I will have you arrested for—" "Sir." Breaker took one step closer, looming over the administrator. "We are operating under Title 50 authority, sanctioned by the National Security Council. If you do not move, my team will breach these doors and you will be detained for interfering with a federal operation. Now move." Henderson moved. The 4 operators flowed into the ER lobby like water finding cracks in stone. The waiting room fell into absolute silence. A crying baby stopped crying. A man with a compound fracture forgot his pain. The very presence of these men seemed to suck oxygen from the room. They brought with them the smell of gun oil and old sweat and something else. Something primal that civilian noses couldn't quite identify, but instinctively recoiled from. The smell of violence. The smell of men who had recently done terrible things and would do them again without hesitation. Sterling scrambled to his feet, his face red with humiliation and anger. Paul, security, stop them. They're probably here for drugs. They're going to rob the pharmacy. Breaker stopped in the center of the triage area. He didn't look at the patients, didn't look at the doctors. His eyes scanned the nurses' station with systematic precision. Where is she? Breaker barked. Jessica, who was cowering behind the medication cart, found her voice. Who? The nurse. Breaker's hand came to rest near the pistol on his hip. Not threatening, just habitual. New hire, quiet, scars on her hands. Where is Valkyrie? The name hit the room like a grenade. Jessica's face went blank with confusion. Valkyrie? We don't have anyone named Valkyrie. We have a Maeve Bennett. Breaker looked at his three teammates. Some unspoken communication passed between them. The kind of communication that only comes from years of operating together in environments where hand signals mean the difference between life and death. Clear the back, Breaker ordered. Find her. You're looking for Bennett. Two of the operators peeled off, moving toward the staff corridors with weapons at the low ready. Sterling laughed. It was a high-pitched, hysterical sound, completely at odds with the situation. The mouse? The incompetent one? I just fired her. She's probably in the locker room packing her things. He stepped forward, emboldened by his own words. You guys are here to arrest her, right? I knew it. I knew she was unstable. Did she kill someone at her last hospital? Is that why her file was redacted? I want to press charges for assault. She attacked me. You saw my wrist. Breaker turned slowly to face Sterling. The movement was deliberate, predatory. The other operators stopped, their hands tightening on their rifles. The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. You fired her? Breaker asked softly. Damn right I did. Sterling puffed out his chest, misreading the situation completely. She assaulted me. She performed an unauthorized procedure. She's clearly mentally unstable. Probably has PTSD or something. She shouldn't be around patients. I'm going to make sure. Breaker walked up to Sterling until they were nose to nose. The operator was shorter than the doctor by 2 inches, but somehow he seemed to fill all the available space, to grow larger with each step. He smelled of gunpowder and sweat and the coppery tang of blood. If you fired her, Breaker whispered, then you just compromised the most valuable medical asset the United States Navy possesses. And if she's left this building, I'm going to hold you personally responsible for the death of the man in that chopper. The blood drained from Sterling's face. Breaker raised his voice, projecting to his team. Check the locker room. Go! 2 operators sprinted toward the staff areas, their boots thundering on the linoleum. Behind them, in the shadowed alcove near the staff entrance, Colonel Garrett Hawthorne had been watching the entire scene unfold. His hand gripped his cane until his knuckles went white. His jaw was set in a hard line. He'd known this moment was coming, had felt it building for weeks, and now it was here, crashing through the carefully maintained fiction of Maeve Bennett's civilian life like a wrecking ball through tissue paper. Hawthorne pushed away from the wall and limped toward the chaos, his cane clicking on the floor with each step. It was time to stop watching. It was time to choose a side. The locker room door stood between 2 worlds. On one side, chaos. On the other, a woman trying desperately to pretend she was someone she wasn't. Maeve had her shoes tied. Her bag was slung over her shoulder. She was 3 steps from the fire exit, 3 steps from disappearing into the Seattle rain and vanishing into whatever came next. But her feet wouldn't move. The helicopter sound had stopped growing louder, which meant it had landed, which meant they were inside the building, which meant they were looking for her. She could hear boots in the hallway, multiple sets, moving fast, the distinctive rhythm of operators clearing a building. Door, pause, clear, move. Door, pause, clear, move. Getting closer. Her hand hovered over the push bar of the fire exit. One push and she'd be gone. Out into the alley, into the rain, into the anonymous sprawl of the city. but she couldn't make herself do it because she knew that sound, knew what it meant. JSOC didn't spin up a Black Hawk and fly it to a civilian hospital for a training exercise. They came because someone was dying, someone important enough to break every rule in the book. And if they'd come here, to this hospital, looking for her specifically, it meant that someone was dying and no one else could save them. The footsteps stopped outside the locker room door. "Valkyrie," the voice echoed off the metal lockers. It was a voice she hadn't heard in 18 months, a voice she'd tried to drown out with therapy and medication and the numbing routine of night shifts. Commander Jackson Hayes, Breaker, her former team leader, the man who'd carried her out of the Zagros Mountains when she'd taken shrapnel to the leg, the man who'd stood at her bedside for 3 days when the infection had nearly killed her, the man she'd walked away from without saying goodbye. Maeve froze, her hand still on the push bar. "Don't make me chase you, Maeve," Breaker said. His voice was softer now, not the command bark from the hallway, something closer to pleading. "Please." Slowly, so slowly, Maeve turned around. Breaker stood in the doorway. He looked older than she remembered, more gray in the red beard, deeper lines around his eyes, the kind of aging that happens when you lose too many friends and sleep too few hours. But he was still the mountain of a man who'd kicked down doors in Fallujah and Ramadi, still had that presence that made junior operators stand straighter and enemy combatants reconsider their life choices. He'd left his rifle with the team in the hallway. His hands were open, non-threatening, the gesture of someone approaching a wounded animal. "I'm not her anymore, Jack," Maeve said. Her voice came out smaller than she intended. "I'm retired. I'm out. I signed the papers. There is no out for people like us, Maeve." Breaker took one step into the locker room. Just one. "You know that. I know you know that." "I can't do it," Maeve's voice cracked. Tears welled in her eyes, blurring her vision. "I can't lose another one. I can't have that blood on me again. I'm just a nurse now. I hand out Tylenol. I get yelled at by residents who don't know a pneumothorax from a panic attack. It's peaceful." "It's peaceful?" Breaker's laugh was bitter. "Maeve, I saw you in that hallway. You look like a caged animal. You're dying here, slowly. We both know it." "Why are you here, Jack?" Maeve asked, hardening her expression, building walls around herself. "You didn't land a bird in a civilian hospital parking lot just to have a heart-to-heart about my career choices." Breaker's face fell. The tough warrior mask slipped away, revealing something raw and terrified underneath, something that made Maeve's stomach drop. "It's Tex," he said quietly. The name hit Maeve like a physical blow. Her bag slipped from her shoulder and hit the floor with a thud. Tex. Tommy McAllister, 26 years old, kid from Oklahoma who played harmonica around the campfire and made terrible jokes to diffuse tension before operations, who dragged her behind cover in Syria when the ambush went sideways, who'd held pressure on her femoral artery while rounds snapped overhead and promised her she wasn't going to die in that ditch. "No," Maeve whispered. "We were on a training op up near the Canadian border," Breaker said, the words coming faster now. "Live fire exercise, vehicle interdiction scenario. Something went wrong with the breach, a ricochet or a malfunction. We're still not sure." He swallowed hard. Tex took a hit, neck, just above the clavicle, clipped the carotid artery. Maeve felt the blood drain from her face. Her legs went weak. She reached out to steady herself against the lockers. "We have a field dressing on it," Breaker continued, "but he's bleeding out. We couldn't make it back to base. This was the closest level 1 trauma center. Maeve, we have maybe 10 minutes before—" "So bring him to the ER," Maeve shouted, her voice breaking. "Sterling is an idiot, but the trauma team here is capable. They have vascular surgeons. They can't touch him." The words hung in the air between them. "What?" Maeve's voice was barely a whisper now. "Why?" Breaker's jaw clenched. Because the round that hit him, it's not standard issue, it's experimental ordnance, a prototype smart frag designed for vehicle interdiction. Maeve's eyes went wide. Oh God, Jack, those things are magnetic trigger, proximity fuse, and an anti-tamper circuit that'll detonate if removed incorrectly. Breaker finished the sentence for her. It's lodged against his spine, right up against the vertebral column. If a civilian surgeon goes in there the way they learned in med school, if they use standard steel instruments, the magnetic signature will set it off. He took another step closer. It'll detonate, or it'll fragment and sever his spinal cord. Either way, Tex dies, and probably takes the surgeon with him. Maeve leaned against the lockers, her breathing coming in short gasps. Jack, I haven't held a scalpel in a year. My hands, they shake. I can't. They shake because you're holding back, Breaker said intensely. He crossed the distance between them and took her hands. Held them up between them. They were trembling. They shake because you're a racehorse pulling a milk cart, because you're using about 10% of what you're capable of, and the rest is eating you alive. He squeezed her hands gently. Look at me. Maeve looked up, met his eyes, saw the fear there, the desperation. Tex is dying, Breaker said. He has maybe 10 minutes. He's in the bird right now. And you know what he said when I told him we were landing here? He said, don't drag her back in. He didn't want us to do this. Didn't want to put this on you. Breaker's voice went rough. But I couldn't let him go. I need you, Maeve. The team needs you. Tex needs you. I need the ghost. I need Valkyrie. Maeve closed her eyes. Behind her eyelids, she saw faces. Young men who'd trusted her, who'd bled under her hands. Some she'd saved, some she hadn't. She saw the operator in the pavehawk with half his jaw missing. Saw the light fade from his eyes while she screamed for more blood, more plasma, more time. She saw the ambush in Syria, the choice she'd had to make. 2 wounded operators, 1 bag of O-negative, having to decide who lived and who died based on nothing but cold calculation and triage protocols that felt like playing God. But she also saw Tex, saw him grinning at her across the campfire, saw him pushing her behind cover while bullets tore the air apart, heard his voice. I got you, Doc. I got you. Maeve opened her eyes. She looked at her hands in Breaker's grip, watched them tremble. Then she thought about the needle decompression, thought about how her hands had been rock steady when Michael Donovan was dying in front of her, how the trembling had stopped the moment she'd stopped pretending to be someone she wasn't. She pulled her hands free from Breaker's grip, reached into her locker, grabbed a pair of trauma shears and shoved them into her waistband. She ripped the elastic from her hair, then gathered it up and tied it in a tight bun, pulling until her scalp ached and her eyes watered. The tightness helped, grounded her, made her feel like herself again. Where is he? Maeve asked. Her voice was different now, flat, cold. The voice of Lieutenant Commander Mitchell, the voice of Valkyrie. Breaker grinned, and for a moment the fear disappeared from his face. Back of the bird. Get him into Trauma Bay 1, Maeve commanded, already moving toward the door. I need 6 units of O-negative, unwarmed. I need the vascular tray and the thoracotomy kit. And I need a magnet, a powerful one. A magnet? Breaker asked, falling into step beside her. The round is magnetically triggered, Maeve said, her mind already running through the procedure. If we use steel instruments near it, the signature triggers the fuse. I need the titanium surgical set. Does this hospital have an MRI suite? I think so. Get your boys to rate it. I need non-ferrous instruments. Titanium, plastic, ceramic. Nothing that can generate a magnetic field. Go. Now. They burst back into the hallway. The 2 operators who'd been searching for Maeve snapped to attention, their weapons lowering when they saw her with Breaker. Behind them, moving with careful precision and the aid of a cane, came Colonel Garrett Hawthorne. Maeve stopped dead when she saw him. Recognition flashed across her face. followed by confusion, then something like understanding. "You knew," she said. "I knew," Hawthorne confirmed. His voice was gravelly, carrying the weight of 7 decades. "I've known since day one, Commander." "How?" "My father served in Korea. Chosin Reservoir, 1950. He was a corpsman there, told me stories about a field surgeon named Captain Evelyn Shaw, who operated in a frozen tent with nothing but flashlights and morphine." Hawthorne's eyes were sharp, assessing. "Those stories are why I joined the Navy in '72. Shaw became a legend, and I learned to recognize her kind when I see them. You have her hands, scars in the same places. The look in your eyes when civilians talk about medicine like it's filing paperwork." He took a step closer, his cane clicking on the linoleum. "And I pulled your real file, the one with the classification markers. Took some doing, but I've still got friends in the community." "You've been watching me," Maeve said. "Not an accusation, a statement of fact." "Protecting you," Hawthorne corrected. "But now?" He glanced at Breaker, at the operators in the hallway, at the chaos visible through the windows where the Black Hawk's rotors still turned at high idle. "Now you need to stop hiding and start doing what you were born to do." "Colonel, I can't ask you to." "You're not asking, I'm volunteering." Hawthorne straightened as much as his old injuries would allow. "Desert Storm, 1991, Field Hospital at Dhahran. I've held retractors and maintained traction on spinal injuries before. I know how to follow orders in an OR when the situation is FUBAR. You need experienced hands? You've got mine." Maeve stared at him for a long moment. Then she nodded once. "Stay close to me. Do exactly what I say, when I say it. No improvisation. No heroics." "Understood, Commander." "Then let's move," Maeve said. She looked at Breaker. "Where's Sterling? The doctor who fired you?" Breaker's smile was predatory. "Currently explaining to your chief of medicine why he made the worst decision of his career. Want me to?" "No time," Maeve cut him off. She was already moving down the hallway at a run. Her earlier exhaustion and fear burned away by adrenaline and purpose. "Get text to Trauma 1. Move." The ER had descended from pandemonium into something approaching organized chaos. Dr. Thaddeus Prescott, the chief of medicine, had taken command. Years of military service, followed by decades of civilian trauma work, had prepared him for exactly this kind of disaster. He'd cleared Trauma Bay 1 completely, had nursing staff prepping every piece of equipment they might need, and had physically restrained Dr. Sterling from interfering further. When Maeve burst through the doors flanked by Breaker and Hawthorne, Prescott looked up from the supply cart he was organizing. Their eyes met across the trauma bay. Prescott's widened slightly in recognition, not of Maeve Bennett, the nervous night shift nurse, but of something else. Something in the way she moved now, the set of her shoulders, the cold calculation in her eyes. "Commander Mitchell, I presume," Prescott said quietly. "Dr. Prescott," Maeve didn't slow down. "I need this bay cleared of all non-essential personnel. I need the titanium surgical set from the MRI suite, and I need everyone who stays in this room to understand that the patient has a live explosive device lodged against his cervical spine." Prescott didn't hesitate. "Clear the bay," he shouted. "Everyone out except surgical staff." Nurses scattered. Techs grabbed equipment and fled. Within 30 seconds, the trauma bay held only Maeve, Prescott, Hawthorne, and Jessica, who'd refused to leave despite 3 direct orders. "I'm staying," Jessica said firmly. 3 months of cruelty seemed to collapse in on themselves. Every joke she'd made, every betting pool, every whispered insult, all of it felt small and shameful now. She looked different. The mockery was gone from her face, replaced by something harder, something earned. Respect born not from authority, but from witnessing true competence under fire. "You're going to need a scrub nurse. I'm the best you've got." Maeve assessed her for a moment, then nodded. "Glove up. Follow my orders exactly. No questions, no hesitation. Clear?" "Clear." The doors burst open again. Two SEALs rushed in carrying a stretcher between them. On it lay Tex. Tommy McAllister looked like death warmed over. His skin was the color of old newspaper. His fatigues were soaked with blood from the collarbone down. His eyes were half open, glassy with shock and blood loss. But when he saw Maeve, something flickered in those eyes. Recognition. And something that might have been an apology. "Hey, Doc," Tex wheezed. His voice was barely audible. "Told them not to. Told them to leave you alone." "Shut up and save your breath," Maeve said. She was already at his side, her hands moving over his body with practiced efficiency. "You're going to need it for yelling at me when this is over." She cut away the field dressing that the SEALs had applied. The wound underneath made her stomach clench. Entry point just above the right clavicle, 2 centimeters lateral to the midline. Small entrance wound, which meant the round had tumbled after impact. Probably deformed on entry, which would make extraction even more complicated. And buried somewhere in that wound track was a piece of experimental ordnance that could detonate and kill everyone in the room. "BP is 70/40, Jessica called out, her voice steady despite the situation. She'd connected Tex to the monitors and was running the vital signs. "Heart rate 140. Oxygen sat 88%. He's in hypovolemic shock." "Hang 2 units of O-neg wide open," Maeve ordered. "Get his pressure up to at least 90 systolic, or his heart's going to empty before I can clamp the bleeder." "On it." Maeve looked up at Breaker. "I need that MRI kit. Now." "On it." Breaker disappeared. She looked at Hawthorne. "Colonel, I need you at the head of the bed. You're going to maintain cervical spine stabilization. Once I start working, Tex cannot move. Not a millimeter. If he coughs, if he jerks, if he so much as twitches wrong, this thing could shift. If it shifts, it detonates," Hawthorne finished. He moved to the head of the bed without hesitation, setting his cane aside. His hands, weathered and scarred, came to rest on either side of Tex's head. "I've got him." The door slammed open. Sterling stood there, his face flushed, his injured wrist wrapped in an ace bandage. "This is insane," he shouted. "Bennett, you can't do this. You're not a surgeon. You're going to kill him." Maeve didn't even look up. "Ghost," she called to one of the SEALs standing guard. The operator, a quiet sniper with cold eyes, stepped forward. "Ma'am, if that man takes one more step into this room, shoot him in the leg." Ghost's hand went to his sidearm. He didn't draw it, didn't need to. The gesture was enough. Sterling went pale. "You can't." "I just did," Maeve said flatly. She looked at Prescott. "Doctor, either remove him from my trauma bay or I'll have him removed. Your choice." Prescott grabbed Sterling by his good arm and physically dragged him out of the room. Sterling's protests faded as the door swung shut and Ghost locked it from the inside. "BP rising," Jessica called. 80/50. First unit is almost in." "Good. Hang the second one." Maeve's hands moved over Tex's neck, palpating the wound edges, feeling for the foreign object with fingertips that had learned to see through touch. "I can feel the casing. It's deep, wrapped up in the fascia and pressing against the carotid sheath." Breaker returned with a young man in tow. Dave, the radiology tech, carried a tray loaded with plastic and titanium instruments. His hands shook badly enough to rattle the tray. "Got everything from the MRI suite that wasn't bolted down," Dave stammered. "All non-ferrous, just like you said." "Outstanding work, Dave." Maeve's voice softened slightly. "Now get behind the lead shield over there and stay down. If this goes wrong, that shield might save your life." Dave didn't need to be told twice. He scurried behind the portable lead screen used for fluoroscopy procedures. Maeve pulled on sterile gloves, not the standard latex ones, specialized, non-conductive gloves used for working near MRI magnets. She selected a pair of titanium forceps from the tray, testing their grip. The room fell silent except for the rhythmic whoosh, click of the ventilator and the steady beep of the cardiac monitor. Jack, Maeve said without looking up, if this goes wrong, if it detonates, the blast radius in a confined space like this is going to be catastrophic. You need to get your boys out of here. Not happening, Breaker said flatly. Jack, we go where you go, Doc. That's how this works. You know that. Maeve's jaw clenched. She did know that. It was why she'd left. Because she couldn't stand the weight of that loyalty anymore. Couldn't stand knowing that good men would die to protect her while she tried to save others. All right, she said quietly. Jessica, last chance to leave. Not a chance in hell, Commander, Jessica said. Her earlier mockery had transformed into something like awe. I'm seeing this through. Maeve took a deep breath, held it, released it slowly. Then she lowered the titanium forceps into the wound. I'm at the wound track, she murmured, her voice dropping into the cadence of surgical narration. Passing through subcutaneous tissue, there's significant swelling. The tissue planes are disrupted. I can feel the casing now. It's jagged along the edges, definitely deformed on impact. Her hands moved with microscopic precision. In this moment, there was no tremor, no hesitation. This was what she'd been trained for, what she'd been born for. The round is wrapped in the platysma muscle. I'm going to have to dissect it free before I can visualize the vascular injury. She worked in silence for 30 seconds, a minute. The only sounds were her breathing, the monitors, and the faint metallic whisper of titanium instruments moving through tissue. Tex's heart rate is spiking, Jessica said quietly. 140, 150. He's feeling it, Maeve said. The anesthesia isn't deep enough. Push another 50 of rocuronium and 100 of fentanyl. Pushing now. Maeve continued dissecting. She couldn't use suction because the metal tip of the suction catheter would trigger the magnetic fuse. Instead, she used gauze sponges to dab away blood, working half-blind in a pool of dark red that kept welling up from the torn vessel. I have the bleeder, she said. Partial transection of the internal jugular. I'm clamping it now. She placed a plastic hemostat on the vein. The bleeding slowed to an ooze. Okay, Maeve exhaled slowly. Now for the hardware. She went deeper. The tip of the forceps brushed against something hard, something that didn't belong in human tissue. And the room filled with a sound that made everyone freeze. A high-pitched whine. Faint at first, then growing louder. The sound of capacitors charging. The sound of a circuit coming online. What is that? Dave's voice came from behind the lead shield, high and terrified. Capacitor charge, Breaker said quietly. His face had gone pale. The anti-tamper circuit. It's waking up. The whine climbed higher in pitch, moving from the range of human hearing into something that set teeth on edge and made bones ache. Don't move, Maeve hissed. Her forceps were frozen in place, the tips touching the round but not gripping it. Nobody move. Nobody breathe. The whine grew higher. Higher. The round was sensing the disturbance. Its tiny electronic brain was calculating probabilities, running algorithms, trying to determine if it should explode or stand down. Maeve closed her eyes. Behind her eyelids, she saw the technical schematics she'd studied years ago during an EOD briefing. The Mark IV Smart Frag, designed to detect and destroy vehicle engine blocks. It had a 3-second delay once the anti-tamper circuit fully armed. 3 seconds between full activation and detonation. I have to pull it, Maeve said. Her voice was calm, eerily calm. Right now. If I go slow, it finishes the arming sequence and we all die. If I yank it, I might tear the carotid and Tex bleeds out in seconds. Your call, Valkyrie, Breaker said softly. Hawthorne's voice cut through the tension. My father told me about Captain Shaw at Chosin, surgery in a frozen tent. She told him something that stayed with him his whole life. His hands remained rock steady on Tex's head. She said the difference between a good surgeon and a dead patient is the willingness to commit. Hesitation kills more people than mistakes. Maeve's eyes snapped open. She adjusted her grip on the forceps. On three, she said. One, the whine became a scream. Two, she could feel the round vibrating now, micro vibrations traveling up the forceps into her hands. Three, Maeve pulled. It wasn't a yank. It wasn't slow. It was somewhere in between. A smooth, powerful extraction with just enough force to overcome the tissue adhesions without tearing the great vessels. The round came free with a wet, sucking sound. A small cylindrical object, no bigger than a lipstick tube, covered in blood and shredded tissue. The whine stopped. Complete silence. For one heartbeat, two, three. Then the round began to whine again, higher and faster than before. Jessica, basin, Maeve shouted. Now! Jessica shoved a stainless steel basin under Maeve's hands. Maeve dropped the round into the saline solution with a splash. Dave! Maeve's voice cracked like a whip. Run! Loading dock! Throw it as far as you can! Go! Dave grabbed the basin and ran. He crashed through the door, sprinting down the hallway. The basin held out in front of him like he was carrying a live cobra. The room held its collective breath. 5 seconds passed. 10, 15. Then the building shook. A dull, thumping boom that rattled the cabinets and made the floor vibrate. Car alarms started wailing in the parking lot. The lights flickered. Dave had made the throw. Outside the trauma bay in the hallway, Dr. Sterling stopped his ranting mid-word. His face went from red to white as the realization of what had almost happened crashed over him. Inside the bay, Maeve didn't pause to celebrate. She was already moving, dropping the plastic instruments and grabbing standard steel needle drivers from the crash cart. Now I fixed the artery, she said. Jessica, 4-0 proline. Let's close this up. Her hands moved in a blur, throwing stitches, tying knots, closing layers of tissue, sealing the jugular vein with tiny, precise sutures that would hold under arterial pressure. BP rising, Jessica said. Her voice was filled with something like wonder. 90/60, 100/65. Sinus rhythm. He's stabilizing. Maeve placed the final stitch, cut the thread, applied a sterile dressing and taped it down. Then she stripped off her gloves and dropped them on the floor. He's going to make it, she said quietly. And then the adrenaline dumped. Her knees buckled. The room tilted sideways. She felt herself falling and couldn't stop it. Breaker caught her before she hit the ground, his massive hands gentle as he supported her weight. Easy, Doc, he said softly. Easy. You did good. Hawthorne released his hold on Tex's head and stepped back, his hands shaking slightly now that the crisis had passed. He reached for his cane, leaning heavily on it. Outstanding work, Commander, he said. His voice was rough with emotion. Captain Shaw would be proud. Maeve looked up at him, still supported by Breaker. Thank you, Colonel, for being here, for trusting me. Trust had nothing to do with it, Hawthorne said. I've seen enough combat surgeons to know competence when I see it. You're the real deal, Commander. The door to the trauma bay opened slowly. Prescott stood there, his face carefully neutral. Behind him, a crowd of hospital staff pressed close, trying to see inside. Sterling was there too, his earlier bravado completely gone. He looked at Maeve with something between awe and terror. Prescott stepped into the room, his eyes taking in the scene. The blood-soaked drapes, the borrowed MRI instruments, the patient breathing steadily on the gurney, the woman who'd been the target of months of mockery, now supported by a Navy SEAL operator, while a retired colonel watched with undisguised respect. Commander Mitchell, Prescott said formally, a word, please, when you're able. Maeve pushed herself upright, gently extricating herself from Breaker's support. She swayed slightly but stayed on her feet. I can talk now, Doctor. Prescott glanced at the crowd in the hallway. Perhaps somewhere more private. No. Maeve's voice was firm. Whatever you need to say it here, in front of everyone. Prescott studied her for a long moment. Then he nodded. As you wish. He turned to face the crowd in the hallway, his voice carrying clearly. What we just witnessed was the most extraordinary piece of emergency medicine I've seen in 40 years of practice. Commander Mitchell performed a high-risk surgical extraction under conditions that would have broken most surgeons. He looked at Sterling. Dr. Sterling, you will report to my office immediately following this shift. You are suspended pending a full review of your conduct. Your treatment of Commander Mitchell was not only unprofessional, but potentially endangered the life of a critically injured patient through your incompetence. Sterling's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Prescott turned back to Maeve. Commander, I understand you've submitted your resignation. I was fired, sir, Maeve said quietly. The termination is void. Dr. Sterling lacked the authority to make that decision. Prescott's expression softened slightly. I would very much like you to stay on staff at St. Jude's. We could use someone with your skill set and experience. Maeve looked around the trauma bay, at Jessica, who was cleaning up with a new respect in her eyes, at Hawthorne, leaning on his cane, watching her with understanding, at Tex, breathing steadily, alive because of what she'd just done, at Breaker, who was reaching into his pocket for something, a satellite phone. He held it up. Admiral wants to talk to you. Maeve took the phone with hands that were starting to tremble again, now that the crisis had passed. She held it to her ear. Commander Mitchell. Admiral Hollet's voice was warm, but firm. The voice of a man who'd sent hundreds of operators into harm's way and lost his share of good people. That was one hell of a piece of work. Thank you, sir. We need you back, Maeve. The teams need you. You can't hide in a civilian ER forever. Maeve closed her eyes. She could feel all the eyes on her. The hospital staff, the SEALs, Hawthorne, everyone waiting to see what she would choose. You're a healer, the Admiral continued, but you're a warrior first. The team is rotating back to the sandbox in 48 hours. There's an empty seat on the Bird. It's yours if you want it. Maeve opened her eyes. She looked at Tex, still unconscious but stable. Looked at Breaker, her brother in arms, watching her with hope and understanding. She looked at Dr. Sterling, still standing in the hallway, his earlier arrogance replaced by the dawning understanding of how badly he'd misjudged her. And she looked at Hawthorne, the old colonel who'd watched over her in silence, who'd understood what she was running from, who'd been there when she needed him most. Admiral, Maeve said slowly, I'm not coming back to the teams. Breaker's face fell. He looked like he'd been shot. But I'm not staying here either, Maeve continued. She straightened her shoulders, stood at something approaching attention, even in her blood-stained scrubs. Sir, the Naval Special Warfare Center has a backlog of 300 combat medic candidates learning outdated protocols from instructors who've never operated in the current theater. They're learning from textbooks written 10 years ago by people who've never held a real sucking chest wound together while rounds snap overhead. The Admiral was silent on the other end of the line, listening. I want to be the lead instructor for the Special Operations Combat Medic course, Maeve said. Full autonomy over the curriculum. I want my commission reinstated but strictly stateside. No deployments, no rotations overseas. I'll teach them how to keep the boys alive so I don't have to do it myself anymore. The silence stretched for 5 seconds. 10. Then, done. Report to Coronado on Monday. Welcome home, Valkyrie. The line went dead. Maeve handed the phone back to Breaker. He was grinning now, a huge smile splitting his beard. Instructor Mitchell, he said, God help those recruits. You're going to eat them alive. Only the weak ones, Maeve smiled, the first genuine smile that had crossed her face in months. She turned to face the hospital staff crowded in the doorway, turned to face the people who'd mocked her, dismissed her, treated her like she was broken. Dr. Sterling, she said, her voice carried clearly down the hallway. Sterling flinched. Maeve walked toward him. Not the hunched, defensive crouch anymore. She stood straight, shoulders back, head high, She stopped in front of him, and for a moment, Sterling looked like he wanted to run. "Regarding the patient in room 402, Maeve said calmly, "the post-op appendectomy from 2 weeks ago. You were right. I didn't push the labetalol." Sterling blinked in confusion. "I didn't push it because he was allergic to beta blockers. It was in his file, right there in the allergy section. If I had followed your order, I would have killed him." Maeve's voice was soft, but carried the weight of absolute certainty. "I fixed your mistake, just like I fixed this one." She turned to Jessica, the head charge nurse who'd made Maeve's life hell for 3 months, who'd started betting pools about how long she'd last. "You stayed," Maeve said. "When Sterling ran, when everyone else evacuated, you stayed. You held the line, followed orders, didn't panic." She held out her hand. "You're a good nurse, Jessica. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise." Jessica took her hand, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you, Commander. I'm so sorry. I'm so—" "It's done," Maeve said gently. "It's over." She looked at Hawthorne. The old colonel was watching her with something that might have been pride. "Colonel," Maeve said, "I could use a senior tactical medical advisor at Coronado, someone who understands a history, who can teach the old skills that keep getting lost. Who knows what combat medicine looked like before GPS and medevac and all the modern conveniences." Hawthorne's eyebrows rose. "You offering me a job, Commander? I'm offering you a purpose, if you want it." Hawthorne was quiet for a long moment. Then he smiled. It transformed his weathered face, took years off him. "When do we start?" "Monday morning, 0700 hours. Don't be late." "Wouldn't dream of it." Breaker stepped forward, clapping a massive hand on Maeve's shoulder. "We can give you a lift to Coronado if you want. Beats taking a commercial flight." Maeve looked at the Black Hawk, still visible through the windows, its rotors spinning at idle. Looked at her old life, waiting to carry her toward her new one. "Yeah," she said. "One last ride won't hurt." The group moved toward the exit. Maeve Bennett, who'd been the mouse of St. Jude's for 3 months, walked out flanked by 4 of the deadliest men on the planet and 1 retired colonel who'd seen more combat than most people could imagine. Behind them, Sterling stood in the hallway, watching them go. His face was pale, his injured wrist throbbing, his career in shambles. Prescott appeared at his elbow. "Dr. Sterling, my office, now." As they walked away, Sterling looked back at the trauma bay, at the blood-stained floor, at the evidence of what real medicine looked like when practiced by someone who'd learned their trade in places where mistakes meant death. He had a lot to learn, and for the first time in his life, he was humble enough to know it. Outside, the Black Hawk's turbines began to spool up. The whine grew into a roar. The rotors accelerated, kicking up a storm of debris. Maeve climbed into the cabin and sat next to Tex. The young operator was still unconscious, but his color was better, his breathing steady. Hawthorne pulled himself up with a grunt of effort, settling into the seat across from her. The other SEALs boarded, weapons secured, ready for the flight. As the helicopter lifted off, Maeve looked down through the window. She saw St. Jude's Medical Center growing smaller below her, saw the life she'd tried to build as a civilian falling away. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the dog tags she'd hidden for so long, held them up to catch the light filtering through the cabin. Then she placed them around her neck. The cold metal settled against her skin, familiar and right. The mouse was dead. Valkyrie was back, and she had work to do. 6 months later, the lecture hall at the Naval Amphibious Base in Coronado was brutally hot. The air conditioning had failed again, and 50 combat medic candidates sat in rigid attention, sweat soaking through their fatigues, every eye locked forward. The door at the front of the room opened. Lieutenant Commander Maeve Mitchell walked in wearing crisp Navy working uniform, with silver oak leaf insignia gleaming on her collar. Behind her, moving with the careful precision of old injuries, came Colonel Garrett Hawthorne in civilian consulting clothes. Maeve stopped at the podium. Hawthorne took a seat to the side, his cane propped against the desk. The room was silent, absolutely silent. Maeve scanned the faces, young, eager, terrified. A mix of Navy corpsmen, Army medics, and Air Force pararescue candidates. All of them here because they'd volunteered for the hardest medical training the military offered. "My name is Commander Mitchell," she said, her voice projected to the back of the room without effort. "Most of you think you're here to learn how to put on a tourniquet. You're wrong. Any monkey can put on a tourniquet." She clicked the remote. The screen behind her lit up with combat footage. Real footage, unedited. Chaos and blood and screaming. "You're here to learn how to think when the world is ending," Maeve said. "You're here to learn how to keep your hands steady when your heart is hammering at 200 beats per minute. You're here to learn how to save lives when everything you learned in a classroom goes out the window and all that's left is you, your training, and a dying man who's depending on you." She stepped out from behind the podium and walked down the center aisle, looked each recruit in the eye. "Some of you have heard stories about me," she said. "You've heard I'm hard. You've heard I wash out more candidates than any other instructor. You've heard I'm a ghost." She stopped in front of a young female candidate whose hands were trembling slightly on her desk. Maeve looked at those shaking hands, then up at the woman's eyes. She smiled, warm and genuine. "They're right," Maeve said softly, "but stick with me and I'll make you unbreakable." She turned back to the front of the room. Hawthorne was watching her with approval. "Colonel Hawthorne will be teaching historical combat medicine," Maeve said. "The techniques that worked in Korea, in Desert Storm, in operations most of you have never heard of. The old skills that too many modern medics have forgotten. The skills that might save your life when all the fancy equipment fails." Hawthorne stood leaning on his cane. "Gentlemen and ladies," he said, his gravelly voice carrying authority earned over decades. "Some of the best medicine I ever saw practice was done with equipment that wouldn't pass inspection in a modern field hospital. We're going to teach you how to improvise, how to adapt, how to keep someone alive with nothing but what's in your aid bag and what you can scavenge." Maeve nodded. "This is a partnership. Old wisdom and new techniques, traditional skills and modern knowledge. That's what makes you complete warriors." She looked out at the class. "First exercise, who can tell me the signs and symptoms of a tension pneumothorax?" Half the hands in the room went up. "Good. Now who can tell me how to perform a needle decompression in the back of a moving vehicle while taking fire?" The hands dropped. Maeve smiled. "That's what I thought. Colonel, lights please." The room went dark, and the real education began. Later that afternoon, Maeve found herself in the recovery wing of the training facility. Tex was there, fully healed now, training the new BUD/S class. He sat on a bench outside the pool, his harmonica in his hands, playing a slow, mournful version of Shenandoah. Maeve sat down next to him. They didn't speak for a long moment, just listened to the music and watched the tadpoles struggling through pool exercises. "How's the neck?" Maeve finally asked. "Solid," Tex said, setting down the harmonica. He touched the scar with 2 fingers. "Your stitches held through Hell Week." Instructor said it was the cleanest surgical site he'd ever seen on an operator. "Good." "Doc," Tex said quietly, "I'm sorry about dragging you back in. About—" "Don't," Maeve cut him off. "You didn't drag me anywhere. You gave me an excuse to stop running." Heavy footsteps announced Breaker's arrival. The big SEAL dropped onto the bench next to Tex, making it creak under his weight. "How'd the first class go?" Breaker asked. "I broke 2 of them in the first hour," Maeve said. "Made one cry. Another asked to be transferred to a different course." Breaker grinned. "So, normal then." The sound of a cane on concrete made them turn. Hawthorne approached, moving carefully down the path. "Mind if an old man joins you?" he asked. "Please, Colonel," Maeve said, sliding over to make room. Hawthorne sat with a grateful grunt. For a moment, the 4 of them sat in silence. 2 generations of warriors. Different eras, different wars, same code. I had a visit from Sterling, Hawthorne said after a while. Maeve looked at him in surprise. What? He's working at St. Mary's in Portland now. Drove down here specifically to see me. Wanted to know if I could get him copies of your teaching materials. Seriously? Apparently he's been studying everything he can find on battlefield trauma protocols. Saved 3 lives in the past 6 months using techniques he learned from watching what you did that day. Hawthorne pulled an envelope from his pocket. He sent this. Said I should give it to you. Maeve opened the envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter on hospital stationery. Commander Mitchell, I was wrong. About everything. About you, about medicine, about what it means to be a doctor. I've spent the last 6 months trying to become the physician I should have been from the start. I saved a man last week. Tension pneumothorax, just like the one you diagnosed. I heard your voice in my head, telling me what to look for. Saw your hands demonstrating the procedure. I'll never be as good as you, but I'm trying to be better than I was. Thank you for not destroying me when you had every right to. Dr. Caleb Sterling. Maeve read the letter twice, then folded it carefully and put it back in the envelope. He's learning, she said softly. They all learn, Hawthorne said. Eventually. The smart ones learn from watching. The stupid ones learn from their mistakes. The lucky ones get a chance to learn from both. Tex picked up his harmonica again and started playing. A brighter tune this time, something with hope in it. Think I'll write him back, Maeve said. Send him some reading materials. Maybe he can help teach the next generation of civilian trauma docs how to not be completely useless. That's what teachers do, Hawthorne said. We pass it on, the skills, the knowledge, the hard-earned wisdom that comes from seeing too much death and refusing to accept it. Breaker stood, checking his watch. Gotta run. Briefing in 20. But Maeve? He looked down at her. Thank you. For coming back. For teaching them. They need you. They need all of us, Maeve said, gesturing to the group. Old skills and new. That's how we keep them alive. After Breaker left, the 3 of them sat in comfortable silence. Teacher and student and patient. Warrior and healer and survivor. You know what my father told me Captain Shaw said? Hawthorne said quietly. At Chosin, after 3 days of nonstop surgery, he asked her how she kept going, how she dealt with the ones she couldn't save. What did she say? Maeve asked. She said, I don't save them for me. I save them so they can go home and teach their sons and daughters how to be brave. Every life saved is a whole future that gets to exist. That's worth every sleepless night. Hawthorne looked at Maeve. You're doing the same thing now. Every candidate you train is potentially dozens of lives saved. Maybe hundreds. That's your legacy, Commander. Not the ones you save yourself, the ones your students will save. Maeve felt tears prick her eyes but didn't let them fall. Thank you, Colonel, for understanding, for being here. Nowhere else I'd rather be, Hawthorne said. The sun was setting over Coronado, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. The BUD/S candidates finished their pool exercises and dragged themselves out of the water, exhausted and pushed to their limits. Tomorrow they do it again, and the next day, and the day after that. Because that's what warriors did. They pushed, they endured, they learned. And when they were ready, teachers like Commander Maeve Mitchell and Colonel Garrett Hawthorne would send them into the world, prepared to save lives when everything went wrong. The mouse was dead. The ghost had found her purpose. Valkyrie had come home. And the work of building the next generation of warriors had only just begun.